I had always wanted to go camping in the French countryside. There was something about the untouched woods, the quiet little towns, and the big open fields that felt so peaceful. After working nonstop for months, I decided to take a week off and finally do it. I picked a spot deep in the woods, not far from a small village, where there weren't many people around. It seemed like the perfect place to relax. The first 2 days were calm. The trees stood tall and still, with just the sound of leaves moving every now and then. At night, it was cool but not freezing, and the stars above stretched across the sky. I had everything I needed, set up my tent, and made simple meals over the fire. There wasn't anyone around for miles, and I liked that. It felt like I had the whole forest to myself. But on the third night, things started to feel different. As the sun went down, I realized the usual calm was gone. The woods were too quiet. No birds, no wind, nothing. Felt like the forest was waiting for something. I tried to ignore it, but it left me feeling uneasy, like something wasn't right. I made dinner like I usually did and got into my tent once the fire went out. I wanted to sleep, but that feeling of something being wrong wouldn't go away. I lay in the dark, listening to the silence, hoping it was just my mind playing tricks on me. Eventually, I must have fallen asleep from being so tired. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up suddenly. The tent was completely dark, and at first, I didn't know why I was awake. Then I heard it, a sound I couldn't ignore. Footsteps, slow, heavy footsteps, coming from just outside my tent. My heart was pounding, and I stayed as still as I could, barely breathing. I didn't want to believe what I was hearing, but it was real. The footsteps got closer, circling around my tent. I tried to tell myself it was an animal, but the way the steps sounded, they were too slow, too heavy, too much like a person. I grabbed my flashlight, trying not to make any noise, and turned it on. The light flashed through the tent, and for a second, the steps stopped. Everything went quiet again, but my mind was racing. What if someone was out there? What were they doing? I listened, hoping it would go away, but after a few moments, the steps started again, this time moving away, back into the forest. I stayed awake the rest of the night, my heart racing every time I thought I heard something. But the footsteps didn't come back. When the sun finally started to rise, I cautiously stepped out of my tent. There were no signs that anyone had been there. No tracks, no broken branches, nothing out of place. But that feeling that someone had been watching me stuck around. I packed up my things as quickly as I could, deciding I'd had enough of the French woods. On the drive back to the village, I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. Someone or something had been out there walking around my camp. I kept trying to make sense of it, but the more I thought about it, the more unsettled I felt. It didn't seem like something I could just brush off. A few days later, when I was back home, I did some digging online to see if I could find out more about the area. That's when I came across some old stories about people disappearing in that forest. Hikers and campers who went into the woods and never came back. No one ever found their bodies, and the local police had stopped looking after a while. That was all I needed to know. I'll never go back to that place, not even close. It felt like the forest was hiding something dark that I was lucky to escape from. I still wonder what was out there that night, circling my tent. But part of me thinks it was just a warning. Next time, I might not be so lucky. I remember it like it just happened. In the summer of 1931, I made the choice to go camping by myself for a few nights in the woods outside a small town. I wanted to get away for a while. No noise, no people, just me and the quiet of the woods. I packed my old tent, some food, a lantern, and my knife. The spot I picked seemed perfect. There were tall trees everywhere, and a small stream nearby. I set up my camp in a little clearing that felt safe. It was far enough from town that no one would bother me, but not too deep into the woods. Felt right. The first night was calm. I could hear the usual stuff, crickets, the stream flowing softly, and now and then a noise from a small animal in the bushes. I sat by the fire until it got dark, then crawled into my tent and fell asleep without much trouble. But the second night was different. I can't really explain it, but something felt wrong. When the sun started going down, I noticed how quiet the woods had become. There weren't as many sounds. No crickets, no movement in the bushes, just stillness. I tried to ignore it, thinking I was just overthinking. But as I sat by the fire that night, the feeling of being alone started to change. I hadn't seen another person for miles, but it suddenly felt like I wasn't by myself. I couldn't shake the feeling. It was like I could sense eyes on me, watching from somewhere in the trees. I stayed up longer than I wanted to, just listening. Nothing really happened, but the uneasy feeling didn't go away. Eventually, I forced myself to go into the tent, telling myself I was being paranoid. On the third day, I woke up early, planning to explore around a bit. I stuck to the trails I knew, staying close enough to my campsite so I wouldn't get lost. But on the way back, I noticed something strange. The path I had walked the day before looked different. There were broken branches and the ground looked disturbed, like someone or something had come through there. At first, I thought it was just an animal, but as I walked, I saw something that made me stop. In the dirt were footprints, large ones. They were too big to be mine, and they weren't shaped like any animal prints I'd seen. A cold feeling hit me. I hurried back to camp, and when I got there, my heart skipped a beat. The fire I had put out the night before had been messed with, like someone had tried to stir it up, and some of my food was gone. I stood there for a minute trying to figure it out. I hadn't seen or heard anyone around. It didn't make sense. Who would come all the way out here, touch my stuff, and leave without me noticing? That night I couldn't sleep. Every little noise outside the tent made me jump. I could hear twigs snapping and soft footsteps just beyond the light of my fire. I lay there, holding my knife, trying not to breathe too loud. I wanted to believe I was just imagining it, but the noises wouldn't stop. I felt trapped in my tent, too scared to look outside but too scared to stay in. After hours of this, I finally peeked out of the tent. The fire had burned down to just a few glowing embers, but there was enough light to see the edge of the clearing. And there, at the tree line, I saw someone standing. They were just standing there, perfectly still, watching me. I froze. I hoped they hadn't seen me move. I couldn't make out much in the darkness, but I could tell it was a tall person. They didn't move closer, didn't leave, just stood there staring in my direction. I spent the entire night like that, holding my knife and waiting for them to do something. But they didn't. When the sun finally began to rise, I looked out again. They were gone, as if they had never been there at all. I didn't waste time. As soon as there was enough light, I packed up my things and got out of there as fast as I could. I didn't eat, didn't even check if I left anything behind. I just needed to get away. I don't know who or what was out there in those woods, but I never went back to that spot. Maybe it was just a wanderer, or maybe someone had been watching me from the moment I set up camp. I'll never know. But every now and then, even now, I get that same feeling again, that cold, creeping sense that someone is just out of sight, watching. And I wonder if they ever really left, or if they're still out there, waiting for the right moment to step closer. I was part of a small army unit stationed at a remote training camp deep in the woods. We were out there for a week-long survival exercise, meant to push us to our limits. Our camp was surrounded by thick trees and dense brush, with only a few makeshift tents and a small fire pit to keep us warm at night. The first few days were normal training drills, navigational tasks, and the usual camaraderie that comes with roughing it. But on the fourth night, something started to feel off. I was on night watch alone while the others slept. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the occasional rustle of leaves. Around midnight, I heard a faint noise, like footsteps crunching on dry leaves. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon. I scanned the dark forest, but all I could see were shadows shifting in the moonlight. I tried to shake off the unease and focus on my duty. The noise grew louder and closer. I gripped my flashlight tighter, trying to cut through the darkness with its beam. The footsteps stopped suddenly, and an eerie silence settled over the camp. My heart pounded. I knew something wasn't right. I moved cautiously towards the noise, trying to stay as quiet as I could. As I got closer to the edge of the camp, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A figure, barely visible, was crouched behind a tree. It looked like a man, but I couldn't make out any details. I froze, unsure if I should move forward or pull back. I decided to back away slowly, hoping to alert the others without making any sudden moves. I turned my head briefly to check on the camp, and when I looked back, the figure was gone. I was about to let out a sigh of relief when I saw a pair of fresh boot prints in the dirt, large military-style prints that didn't match any of ours. I rushed back to wake the others. We packed up our gear quickly, staying alert for any signs of danger. The unsettling feeling didn't go away as we hurried to dismantle our camp and load our gear. Just before dawn, we drove away from that remote, eerie forest. When we finally got back to base, we learned there had been a recent escape from a nearby maximum security prison. The description of the escapee matched the figure I'd seen. We had unknowingly crossed paths with a dangerous fugitive. That night in the woods, we narrowly avoided a deadly encounter. We had no idea how close we had come to a real nightmare. The thought that someone could have been lurking in the dark, right outside our camp, is something that still sends chills down my spine. It was supposed to be a quiet weekend. My neighbor, Tom, and I decided to camp in the woods behind our houses. We set up our tents a few 100 feet apart, hoping to get away from the everyday grind. As night came, I built a fire and sat by it, enjoying the usual forest sounds. I noticed Tom's tent was unusually quiet. It struck me as odd, but I didn't think much of it. Around midnight, the forest went eerily quiet. The usual chirping of crickets and rustling leaves stopped, replaced by a strange silence. I heard soft rustling noises coming from Tom's tent. It sounded like someone, or something, was moving around inside. I figured it was just the night and tried to relax. Then, I saw a flashlight beam flickering in the distance from Tom's direction. I thought he might be searching for something. I picked up my flashlight and went over to check if he needed help. As I got closer, I called out softly, but no one answered. The flashlight beam was moving in an odd way. When I reached Tom's tent, I saw it was unzipped, and the flashlight was on the ground, still shining. The tent was empty. My heart started pounding. I looked around, feeling more and more uneasy. The forest was unnervingly quiet again. I heard footsteps behind me, quick, deliberate steps. I turned around, but there was no one there. My gut told me to get back to my tent and call for help. I rushed back, trying to stay calm. I grabbed my phone but realized there was no signal. I kept my flashlight on and looked around nervously. Hours passed, and the silence felt heavy. Just before dawn, I heard a voice. It wasn't Tom's. It was someone calling for help from the woods. The voice was weak and desperate. I followed the sound, pushing through the thick brush. Eventually, I found Tom. He was disoriented and hurt badly. He had been attacked and knocked out cold. Tom later said he heard someone approaching his tent, so he grabbed the flashlight to check it out. When he stepped outside, someone hit him from behind. He never saw who it was, but his injuries showed the attacker had left him for dead. The police came and searched the area. They didn't find the attacker, but they said it was likely someone local with a bad record. We were lucky to have survived. The worst part was when Tom mentioned seeing dark figures moving around his tent before he was attacked. It felt like the woods themselves had turned against us. We never found out who did this or why. The woods were no longer a safe place, but a chilling reminder that danger could be lurking in the darkest corners. I still get shivers thinking about it and avoid those woods whenever I can. I went camping with my grandmother deep in the woods. She loved being outside and somehow talked me into coming along for the weekend. I wasn't really excited about it, but she always looked so calm out there, so I agreed. We set up our tent near a small stream with tall trees all around us. The first day was pretty quiet. We walked a bit, cooked dinner over a small fire, and watched the stars before heading into the tent to sleep. That night, something felt weird. I couldn't explain it, but the woods were too quiet. No wind, no bugs, just stillness. I lay there for a while, staring at the roof of the tent, feeling uneasy. I told myself it was just because we were so far from anything, and I tried to sleep. The next day, we spent most of it walking around, but that strange feeling stayed with me. Every time I looked at the trees, I got this sense that something was watching us. My grandmother didn't seem to notice anything strange, so I didn't mention it. By the time the sun started going down, I was more than ready to go to sleep and just get through the night. While we sat by the fire that evening, I kept hearing odd noises coming from the woods. It wasn't animals, at least not any I could recognize. The sounds were low, like something big was moving through the bushes, but it never got close enough to see. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, but I didn't want to worry my grandmother, so I stayed quiet. After we put out the fire, we went back to the tent. It was even quieter than the night before. I lay there for what felt like forever, that uneasy feeling growing stronger. My grandmother was sound asleep next to me, totally unaware of how tense I was. At some point, I must have fallen asleep because the next thing I knew, I woke up to the sound of footsteps. They weren't far from the tent, maybe 20 feet or so, and they were slow and steady. I froze, not moving a muscle, listening closely. The steps circled the tent, not too close but never too far. This wasn't just some animal wandering by. Whoever or whatever it was, they were taking their time. I stayed completely still, hardly breathing. The footsteps stopped for a moment, and I hoped they had left. But then they started again, this time even closer. My heart was pounding so hard I thought whoever was out there could probably hear it. I had no idea what to do. Eventually, the footsteps faded into the woods, but I knew it wasn't over. I couldn't sleep after that. I lay awake, listening to every little sound outside the tent. The night dragged on forever, but when the sun finally came up, I was relieved. Tired, but relieved. That morning, we packed up to leave. I didn't tell my grandmother about the noises, but I couldn't wait to get out of there. As we hiked back to the car, I kept looking over my shoulder, feeling like something or someone was watching us. The woods were too quiet again, and it made me feel like we weren't alone. Just before we got to the car, I noticed something by the tree line. There were footprints. They weren't animal tracks. They were big human footprints, fresh, and they had been right next to our tent. I stared at the prints, my stomach turning. Someone had been out there walking around us while we slept, watching us. I looked back at the woods, but I couldn't see anyone. But I knew somehow they were still out there watching, waiting. Maybe they had followed us the whole time, hiding just out of sight. I realized then that no matter how far we drove, no matter how far we tried to get away, we had been seen, marked, and maybe one day they'd come back. I needed a break. Being a cop can take a toll on you, so I figured camping alone for a weekend would help me clear my mind. I found a quiet spot deep in the woods, far away from the noise of cars and the constant rush of people. Felt like the perfect escape. The first night was calm. All I could hear were the sounds of the forest. Leaves blowing in the wind, birds singing, and every now and then, a branch snapping in the distance. It was peaceful. The quiet and fresh air were just what I needed. But on the second night, things felt different. Wrong, even. I set up my tent and got a fire going. But something was off. The forest wasn't as lively as it had been. There were no animal sounds, no breeze, just this strange, heavy silence. I tried to ignore it, thinking maybe I was just overthinking things because of the job. It's hard to fully relax after years of being a cop. You're always alert, always watching. But this silence, it was too much. Felt unnatural. At some point, I started hearing footsteps. They were slow, like whoever or whatever it was trying not to be noticed. They were far away, but not too far. I couldn't tell if it was real or if I was just getting jumpy, but it was enough to make me uneasy. I grabbed my flashlight and scanned the area around my campsite, shining the light into the trees. Nothing. No movement, no sign of anyone. I went back to sitting by the fire, staring into the dark woods. I kept waiting for the sound to come back, but all I could hear was the crackling of the fire. Stayed quiet, and I told myself it had to be an animal. Maybe a deer, something harmless. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Hours passed, and I decided to get some sleep. I crawled into my tent, trying to calm myself down. But then I heard the footsteps again. This time, they were much closer. My heart started racing. I grabbed my flashlight and quietly unzipped the tent, stepping out into the cold night air. I felt this tightness in my chest as I pointed the light toward the trees. Again, nothing, just darkness. But then, as I turned to go back to my tent, I saw them. Footprints, fresh ones, circling my campsite. My blood ran cold. These weren't mine. Someone had been here, walking around me while I sat by the fire, watching me. That realization hit me hard. Someone had been out there, maybe still was watching the whole time. My heart was pounding. I backed into my tent, grabbed my bag and flashlight, and started packing as fast as I could. I wanted out of there. But then I heard it again, those footsteps. And now they weren't just coming from one direction. I could hear them all around me. I froze for a second, listening, trying to figure out how close they were. Whoever was out there, they were close. And there wasn't just one of them. I could feel it, the eyes on me from the dark, just outside the reach of the firelight. My instincts kicked in. I grabbed my stuff and started heading down the trail, my flashlight shaking in my hand. I could hear them following me. Not too close, but close enough to make sure I knew they were there. I walked faster, then started running. The footsteps kept up with me, staying just out of sight. I didn't look back. I didn't stop until I reached my car. I threw my gear in, jumped in the driver's seat, and sped down the dirt road. Before I pulled away, I looked back one last time. Standing at the edge of the trees, just where the light from my car reached, were a few dark shapes. People, watching me. I didn't stop driving until I reached the nearest town. I sat in the car for a while, catching my breath. I thought about reporting it, but I knew better. No one would find anything. I've seen enough in my years on the force to know that sometimes the worst things aren't supernatural or from some fairy tale. Sometimes it's just people. And what's scary is those people out there, they knew the woods better than me. They weren't just watching me for fun. They were waiting. They wanted me to know I wasn't alone out there. And what's worse is I got away, but I have no idea how many others didn't. I was camping alone, deep in the woods, far from anyone. I had been doing this for years, and I always liked the quiet. At night, the only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the soft rustling of leaves in the wind. It usually made me feel calm, but this time, something felt different. I couldn't tell why, but it just felt wrong. It started just before sunset. I was setting up my tent when I noticed how quiet the woods were. Too quiet. No crickets, no birds, nothing. At first, I shrugged it off, but as the night went on, the silence started to bother me. I built a fire and sat by it, eating my dinner. That's when I began to feel it. A strange feeling, like someone was watching me. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see someone standing there. But no one was there. It was just darkness outside the reach of the fire's light. Still, I couldn't shake that feeling. The longer I sat there, the worse it got. I told myself it was all in my head. I was out here alone, far from anyone. There was no reason to feel uneasy, but I couldn't stop the growing fear that was creeping in. Eventually, I decided to go to bed. I figured I'd feel better after some sleep. I crawled into my tent, zipped it up, and lay down, trying to relax. But every little noise outside sounded louder now. Every twig snapping or leaf crunching made my heart race. I kept telling myself it was just animals, but it didn't feel like animals. The sounds were too slow, too careful. I don't know how long I lay there, staring at the roof of my tent, listening to the night. Then I heard it, footsteps. Slow, heavy footsteps, just outside my tent. They stopped right next to me. I froze, holding my breath, too scared to move. There was nothing but silence. The footsteps stopped, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. I waited, barely breathing, for something to happen, but nothing did. After what felt like hours, the footsteps started again, moving away, slowly fading into the trees. I stayed still for a long time, listening, but the footsteps didn't come back. I finally worked up the nerve to grab my flashlight and unzip the tent. I shined the light into the trees, looking for any sign of what or who had been out there. But there was nothing. No tracks, no broken branches, no proof that anyone had been there at all. But I knew what I heard. My heart was still racing, and I knew I had to get out of there. I packed up everything as fast as I could, barely taking time to think. I threw my stuff in the car and sped off, not looking back. I never figured out what or who it was that night. But sometimes, when I'm alone in a quiet place, I still hear those footsteps in my mind, slow and heavy. It makes me wonder if whatever it was didn't really leave that night. Maybe it's still out there, waiting in the dark for me to come back.